She was standing on a ridge with no name on any map, and the camp was gone. Not scattered, not spooked, gone the way things disappear when someone planned it. 8 horses, 5 men. All of it moved south while she rode north into empty country, following a map that was never meant to bring her back. The wind came off the peaks cold and clean. She did not move. Below her, somewhere, a town. A letter with a postmark dated before a man was dead. A name used before she gave it. Someone had been watching before she knew there was anything to watch. She turned east. Not because east was safe, because south was where they went, and she had no intention of following anyone else's plan ever again. The mountains said nothing. They never do. They only keep. She was standing on a ridge that had no name on any map when she understood that no one was coming. The wind moved through the high timber the way it always did in late August, cold even in summer, carrying pine resin and the particular indifference of country that has never needed anyone's permission to exist. Nora Calloway stood very still in the middle of it and looked at the ground. The damp earth held the impressions of shod hooves pressed deep and clean, not the scattered marks of spooked animals. The tracks of horses led deliberately in a single line, south and down the mountain. She counted the impressions. 8 animals, 5 riders, all of them gone while she had been riding north into an empty drainage that no sheep had touched in years, following a map drawn by someone who had never set foot above this elevation. She had been gone 2 hours and 12 minutes. She had not hurried. She had done exactly what she was told. The gelding shifted under her, and she let him settle, and she stayed there on the ridge a long time before she let herself think clearly about what the tracks were saying. The wind pushed her hair across her face. She did not brush it away. A thin cold moved into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature, the kind that arrives when a person stops arguing with what they already know. Harlan Voss had not panicked. He had not made a sudden decision. He had waited until she was far enough up the drainage that she could not hear the animals moving, and then he had gathered the string and walked them quietly back down the mountain with the organized silence of a plan already decided. She understood this in the way you understand things that have been building for a while and have finally arrived at their shape. He had known her name before she gave it to him. He had known her grandfather's land. He had known she had no rifle, no family, no witness in this country. Someone had told him all of it. She turned the gelding east, not because east was safer. East because south was where they had gone, and she had no intention of following. The country opened ahead of her in long descending folds of spruce and granite, dropping toward drainages she half remembered from a summer years ago when her grandfather had brought her through this part of the range. She had been 19 then, James Calloway moving ahead of her on a gray mare, pointing out landmarks with the flat of his hand the way a man points out a road junction to someone who will need to find it again alone. She had not known at the time that he was preparing her for anything in particular. She had thought they were just riding. She understood now that he had always been doing both at once. She rode east until the gelding's right foreleg started going uneven on a long stretch of gray shale. She dismounted before he could stumble, ran her hand down the leg, found nothing hot or swollen, checked the hoof and found the shoe twisted and the clinches pulled. The shale had done it in less than a mile. She stood with the reins over her arm and thought about the distance remaining and the light remaining and what she was carrying. The saddle blanket, the folding knife at her hip, bone handle worn smooth from 2 years of daily use. James's canvas coat, too large across the shoulders, smelling of wood smoke and the specific warmth of someone who had lived in it a long time. $11 folded flat inside the lining of her right boot, the whole of what James had kept in a coffee tin in the pantry, which Birch Rowe had either missed or quietly decided to leave alone. She stripped the saddle from the gelding, pulled the bridle, slapped him once on the flank and watched him move off south at a careful walk, testing the bad leg. He would find water. He would find his way to lower ground. She lifted the saddle blanket and folded it across her shoulders and walked east into the afternoon. She did not think about Harlan Voss. She thought about where her feet were going, and she thought about water, and she thought about the drainage she half remembered, and she put one boot in front of the other across the shale, until it gave way to broken granite, and the granite gave way to a belt of timber that swallowed the sound of the wind and made everything quieter and more manageable. She had grown up understanding that most crises look worse from a distance than from inside them. James had said this to her once, and then demonstrated it by continuing to eat his supper, while a portion of the shed roof came down in a windstorm outside. Nothing else fell. He finished his supper. He went out afterward and looked at the damage in the dark with a lantern and came back in and said it would take a day to fix. That was the end of the crisis. What he had not said, and what she had worked out on her own over time, was that the calm was not the absence of fear. It was a decision made in the presence of fear, repeated every few minutes until the minutes added up into something that resembled composure. She made that choice now, again and again, as the light dropped and the timber thickened around her. She did not make a fire that night. She did not want to be seen. She found the downhill side of a fallen fir, with a root mass large enough to break the wind, and lay against the bark, with the saddle blanket over her and the knife in her hand inside the blanket. The forest was full of the ordinary sounds of night, wind and water and the distant conversation of owls, and none of it was dangerous, and she knew none of it was dangerous, but her body did not entirely agree with her mind on this point, and so she lay in the alert, fractured half-sleep of someone whose instincts are working harder than the situation requires. What she was afraid of was not dying on the mountain. She had been close enough to the mechanics of death to understand it without drama. James had died in his chair by the wood stove on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and it had not been frightening, only very quiet, a completed thing. And she had sat with him a long time before she walked to the neighbor's place to say what had happened. Death did not require her fear. What she was afraid of was something smaller and more specific, that she would vanish from this country without anyone knowing she had been here. That Harlan Voss had calculated this correctly from the start. That a woman with no family and no rifle and no witness could be sent off a false drainage on a faulty map and simply not come back, and the accounting would be clean and simple. She had gotten lost. The mountains took people. No one would ask hard questions about someone who had been counted as nothing from the beginning. She held the bone handle of the knife and reminded herself of what she knew. She knew this range well enough to find water. She knew how to read the slope of the ground and the direction of the drainages. She knew that east of here the country fell toward lower elevation and more trails and more options. She had $11 in James's coat and 2 years of living at altitude with a man who considered asking for help a personal failure and had therefore ensured she would never need to. She was not going to disappear on Harlan Voss's schedule. She slept. She woke before light with frost on the saddle blanket and cold so clean it hurt the lungs, and she was moving within 10 minutes because moving was warmer than not moving. She walked east through the timber in the gray pre-dawn, following the slope of the ground down through stands of lodgepole and into open parks where the grass was brown and flat, and the morning sky above was the color of old pewter just before it brightens. She found water early, a thin creek over pale stones in the bottom of a draw, and she drank from it on her hands and knees and sat back on her heels and looked at the country around her, and then started walking again. The morning was long. She moved at the pace James had called a working walk, not hurried, not slow, the pace that covers ground over hours without wearing through the person covering it. She crossed 2 drainages and climbed one low ridge and came down the other side into older timber where the ground was softer and the light came through at angles. She was hungry in the way that becomes background noise after a while, persistent but not commanding, and she noted it and moved on. It was near noon of the second day when she came down a game trail so narrow the brush touched both shoulders at once. The trail bent around a granite outcrop and opened without warning onto a bench of ground she had not been able to see from above. Flat, grassy, a spring at the north end, the water so clear she could see the individual stones on the bottom from 20 feet away. The grass around the spring was green in a way nothing else at this elevation was green in late August, fed by what ran underneath. And on the bench, set back against the south-facing wall of the ravine, half in shadow and half in late morning light, was a cabin. She stopped at the edge of the tree line and looked at it without moving. Built of squared lodgepole logs, the chinking between them gray with age. The roof was split shakes gone silver through 2 decades of weather, mossy at the north end, clean at the south. The door was 2 thick planks pinned with wooden pegs and hung on hand-forged strap hinges, heavy and clean in their lines. It stood a quarter open, resting on a drift of pine needles that had blown in over however many seasons and lay undisturbed on the threshold. Above the door, cut into the top log with a chisel, was a small 5-pointed star. The cut was old and dark with time. No smoke, no sound, no sign of anything that had built a fire or unsaddled a horse recently. She crossed the bench slowly and looked through the open door before she went in. Stone hearth, cast iron stove with the pipe intact, plank table, a single stool, rope-strung bed frame without a tick, shelves along the west wall with tin plates and cups, a whetstone, a rusted tin of matches, a coil of hemp rope, a floor of wide, split puncheons worn smooth in a track from door to hearth by feet that had crossed it many times and then, at some point long ago, stopped. She went in. The air inside was dry and very cold and smelled of dust and cured pine and something underneath that she could not name, the accumulated presence of years of wood smoke and quiet, and the particular warmth that a space holds long after the warmth itself has gone. She walked the room once, laying her hand on the stove and the bed rope and the table. On the shelf beside the tin cups sat a leather-bound ledger with a bootlace tied around it to keep the cover shut. She did not open it yet. She gathered dry material from the trees at the edge of the bench and built a fire in the stove with the third match from the rusted tin, nursing it through stages. The stove drew well. The pipe was clear. Warmth came into the cabin slowly, and she held her hands near the open stove door and let it come. She drank water from the spring in a tin cup and refilled it and drank again. Then she sat at the table in the growing warmth and untied the bootlace. The first page was written in a careful upright hand, brown ink gone almost to sepia. This cabin was built by me, Samuel Pratt, in the spring of 1866 on ground I found by accident and kept for myself, being at that time 40 years of age, lately mustered out of the Union Army where I served as quartermaster's clerk under Colonel Hadley in the mountain operations of 1863 and 1864, of which more further on. She read with one finger moving under the lines. Samuel Pratt had lived in this cabin for 19 years. He trapped marten and mink along the ravine and cut his own firewood and took 2 elk a year, and never, by his own account, went below the ridgeline for anything he could not carry on his back. He wrote of weather with the precision of a man who has no other clock, of a dog named Ranger who died in his 11th winter, of a woman named Sarah he had loved before the war and not seen again after. He wrote about solitude the way people write about things they have chosen, and then lived with so long they can no longer tell if the choosing was right. Not with regret and not with contentment, but with the flat, careful honesty of a man who has stopped performing for anyone, because there is no one left in the room to perform for. She read for a long time. The fire ticked and settled, and she fed it, without interrupting her reading. The entry dated November of 1884 was longer than the others. The handwriting was the same but slower, more deliberate in its pressure. My heart has given me trouble for some months now, and I do not expect to see another spring. I am setting down in the back of this ledger certain matters I have carried alone for 20 years, and that I wish, if any decent person should find this book, to be finally set down where they might do some good. I leave what I leave to whoever finds this when they are in need of it, because need is its own kind of claim. Below that entry the pages were blank. Behind the last blank page, sewn into the binding with waxed linen thread, was a folded square of oiled paper. She cut the thread with the folding knife, unfolded the paper and pressed it flat. 3 things inside. A hand-drawn map of the ravine and the bench marked in Samuel Pratt's careful hand with a small inked X at the base of the hearth. A sealed envelope addressed in the same hand, for whoever finds this, being a person in need. A smaller sheet, folded once, in a different blockier hand. Inventory of stores cached at Site 9. Hadley Detachment. Spring 1864. She set the 3 papers side by side and looked at the X on the map. Then she went to the hearth and went down on one knee on the puncheons in front of it. The river cobbles at the base were set in lime mortar like the rest, grey and solid. But one section, no larger than a dinner plate, was of a slightly paler color and finer grain. Mixed later, by the same hands, to the same careful standard, but not at the same time as the original work. She worked the point of the folding knife into the first seam. She was patient about it. James had said once that impatience costs more than the time it saves, and she had learned this to be true in the specific way you learn things that are true, which is by doing the opposite first and watching what it costs. She chipped the mortar out joint by joint, clearing each seam until the section of 4 cobbles shifted when she pressed them. She lifted them out and set them on the floor beside her. Beneath them, in a shallow recess lined with tin and closed with a plank lid, was a box. The canvas sack was heavy in a way that made her set it down carefully rather than drop it. When she cut the stitches, gold coins ran onto the puncheon floor with a small dry sound. Double eagles, $20 pieces, more than she could count at first sight, and she stopped counting and set them aside. Second sack of silver dollars, smaller and lighter. An oilcloth-wrapped bundle of paper currency, banded and dry, the bands still holding. A folded army map printed on heavy paper and annotated in pencil, showing the drainages north of Ashford Falls with 9 sites marked in circles and numbered in a hand that was not Samuel Pratt's. A bundle of dispatches tied with red string, and at the very bottom, wrapped in a square of blue wool that had once been part of a uniform coat, something small and solid. She unwrapped it. A brass compass. Small, the size of a silver dollar, the brass worn to a warm gold at the edges where hands had touched it over years. She turned it over in her palm and looked at the back. JC's 1863. She sat very still on the puncheon floor with the compass in her hand and the fire ticking behind her, and thought about those 2 letters and that year. Thought about a man who had told her, in the plainest language he had, that the only things worth having were the things earned by sitting still long enough to understand what you were looking at. Thought about a gray mare and a flat hand, pointing out landmarks she would need to find again without him. Thought about a canvas coat she had borrowed one April morning and never given back because her own was thin at the elbows, and because the coat still held, in the weave of it, something that was not entirely about warmth. James Calloway had been here, had passed through this country in the winter of 1863, in whatever cold and difficult business the mountain operations required. Had been here and had left this compass in the hands of a quartermaster's clerk, and had not come back for it. She sat with this for a long time, let it arrange itself in the careful order James had taught her to use when a situation required clear thinking. Here was what she knew. Here was what she did not know. Here was what she intended to find out. She gathered the coins back into the canvas sack, replaced everything in the tin-lined box, set the plank lid back, lifted the 4 cobbles into place without mortar, fitting them as closely as the original work, laid the square of blue wool flat across the top. Then she crossed to the coat, hung near the stove, and put the brass compass in the inside pocket where her hand could find it without looking. She went out to the spring in the last of the afternoon light and washed her face and hands in water cold enough to make her breath catch. She came back inside and barred the door and fed the stove and lay down on the rope-strung bed with the saddle blanket under her and James's coat over and the folding knife close in the dark, and she slept. She woke with the stove cold and the light through the cracks in the shutter pale and early, and she lay still for a moment and let the place settle around her. 19 years of one man's careful solitude, his tracks worn smooth in the puncheons, his star cut into the beam above the door, his careful ink on 300 pages of weather and longing and quiet. She lay in his bed and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not grief and not fear and not the forward motion of a person who has run out of choices. Something older and simpler than any of those things. The feeling of a place that had been waiting. She got up. To understand where she was going, you had to understand what had brought her here. Not just the 2 days of walking. Not just the empty camp and the tracks going south. You had to go back 2 years to the spring morning when James Calloway died in his chair and the world rearranged itself. And then back further to the morning she had first arrived on his 80 acres with a paper sack of clothes and the understanding that she had nowhere else to go. She had come to him at 18, after typhoid took her parents that winter. Her mother first in February, her father 6 weeks after. The farm sold at auction before the ground had thawed enough to bury either of them properly. She had walked up the valley to the land James Calloway had held since before she was born, and knocked on his door and asked if she could stay. He had looked at her a long moment in the doorway. A tall man, 61 that spring, with a face made by weather and long silences into something neither kind nor unkind, just honest in a way that left no room for performance. He stepped back to let her in without making anything of it, put a pot of beans on the stove, and they ate supper together that evening without speaking very much. In the morning he showed her where everything was. He had scouted for the Union Army in the mountain operations during the war. He did not talk about this. She pieced it together from the few things he mentioned, and from the quality of his silence when certain subjects came near, the specific quiet of a man who has decided that some rooms stay locked, not from shame but from the practical knowledge that reopening them costs more than it returns. He had come back from the mountains after the war, bought his 80 acres, built his cabin and his sheds and his life, and he had been building it for 20 years by the time she arrived with her paper sack. What he gave her was instruction, not comfort. He showed her how to read weather in the aspens, the pale undersides of the leaves flashing before a storm like 1,000 small flags turned by the same hand. He showed her how to build a fire in the wind with wet wood, by shaving down to the dry heart of a branch and protecting the flame with your body while it caught. He showed her the way a mule communicates distress before it becomes visible to the eye. He showed her how to walk on loose shale, by keeping your weight back over your heels and your steps short and deliberate. He showed her how to read a drainage from the high ground above it, the way timber and rock and the angle of light told you where the water was, and where it had been, and whether the ground below would hold a horse or swallow one. None of this was offered as a course of study. It was offered the way he would point out a loose board in the porch or a gap in the fence where cattle were getting through. The world required certain knowledge to navigate, and he was providing it, and there was nothing sentimental in the transaction. That was what made it matter. He thought she was worth teaching. In the economy of James Calloway's regard, that was as close to love as the ledger showed. He gave her the knife on an ordinary morning in April, almost a year after she arrived. He set it on the table beside her coffee without ceremony, bone handle up, 3.5 inches of high-carbon steel he had carried through the mountain campaigns of 1863 and every year after. He said what he said, that a person who knew how to use a knife properly was never truly without a friend. She picked it up and turned it over and felt the weight of it and understood it was old and that giving it away had cost him something, and she had not said thank you in a way that required him to respond. She just put it in her pocket, and later that week she made a sheath from scrap leather and wore it at her hip every day after. He died 2 springs later. His heart simply finished its work on a Tuesday morning while she was checking the fence line along the creek, and when she came back to the cabin for midday, he was in his chair by the stove with his coffee cooling on the windowsill and his eyes closed and his hands loose in his lap, and the door was standing open to the warming wind, and he was gone in the quiet, completed way of a man who had done what he came to do. The 80 acres passed to his surviving brother. She had known this might happen, and knowing it had not prepared her for the particular weight of the letter when it arrived. The letter from Aldous Crane came 7 days after James died. She read it standing at the table and then sat down and read it again. Short, efficient. The property would be sold. She was welcome to remain until the sale closed. She was not welcome to any share of the proceeds. She was welcome, the letter said, to keep her personal effects. She set it in the tin box on the mantel and went out to feed the chickens, because the chickens still needed feeding regardless of what the law had decided. The postmark on the envelope was dated 3 days before James died. Aldous Crane had written this letter, sealed it, and put it in the mail before his brother was gone. He had not been waiting for news. He had been waiting for a date. She turned this over in the following days and came no closer to a conclusion she could prove, only to the cold, clear certainty that the timing was not coincidence. Aldous Crane had known James was dying before James was dead. There was no innocent explanation for that knowledge she could find. Aldous Crane was the younger brother of James Calloway by blood only, which is to say they had shared a mother and a father and nothing else of substance. She had met him twice in 2 years, and both times he had been pleasant in a surface way, the pleasantness of a man who has learned that appearing agreeable costs nothing and occasionally pays well. He was 58 years old, and had made his money in land transactions in the southern part of the territory, and wore good boots, and spoke with the confidence of a person who has never had to wonder for more than a few hours at a stretch where the next meal was coming from. Birch Row arrived 10 days after the letter. A land agent, 52 years old, with a pressed vest and clean hands, and the manner of a man who delivers bad news for a living, and has arranged his face into something that functions as sympathy without requiring it. He sat at James's table and drank James's coffee, and explained in even, measured language that the new owner would take possession on the 1st of September, and preferred the cabin emptied by the last of August. He did not meet her eyes when he listed what she could keep: the Bible, the knife already at her hip, the coat she was already wearing, one blanket, the iron skillet, the tin box from the mantel, the brass compass in the drawer under the window on the grounds that it was a personal item and not inventory, not the rifle. The rifle was inventory. He produced a paper and waited with professional patience for her to sign it, and she signed without reading it a second time because there was nothing in a second reading that would change what the first reading had established, which was that the document said what the situation already was, and her signature only confirmed it. He finished his coffee and thanked her for her time and rode back down the valley in the long slanting light of a summer afternoon, and she stood on the porch until the sound of his horse faded, and then went inside and began folding her clothes into the same paper sack she had arrived with 2 years before. She slept that last night on the bare floor beside the stove, because the bed frame had been counted as inventory. In the morning she walked down to Ashford Falls with her bundle over one shoulder, and the knife at her hip and James's coat, too large across the shoulders, and $11 folded tight in the lining of her right boot. Ashford Falls was a town of one long main street, and the permanent smell of horses, and the particular dust that accumulates where wagons run over the same ground through every season. She walked its length and looked for work the way you look for water in dry country, without hurry, without certainty. She asked at the boarding house, where the woman running it said they were full through the end of the season. She asked at the freight office, where the man behind the counter looked at her bundle and said he had no use for another hand. She walked to Martha Good's Hotel, a 2-story frame building at the north end of the street with yellow curtains in the windows. Martha Good came out from behind the front desk to speak with her, a woman of 55 with silver blonde hair pulled back precisely, and the unhurried manner of someone who has run a business long enough to recognize every category of situation before it fully presents itself. She looked at Nora and looked at the bundle and said she had 2 women working for her already, and the work was steady, and she did not have more than 2 women's worth of it. She said it without cruelty, the way honest people say things that are simply true. Nora thanked her and walked back out. She paid a nickel to Gus Pell, who kept the livery, a taciturn older man who showed her the empty stall at the back without comment or questions, which she appreciated. She slept there the first night on clean straw, with her bundle under her head and the knife in her hand inside the coat and the sounds of the horses breathing around her in the dark. In the morning she ate a biscuit and strip of dried beef she bought from a woman selling food outside the Mercantile, 3 cents, and she stood in the early light on the boardwalk and thought about what she had and what she could do with it. She had $11. She had 2 years of practical knowledge that most men in this town could not quickly acquire. She had the high country at her back like a door she already knew how to open. What she needed was someone willing to pay for what she knew. She heard about the expedition on the 3rd morning. Gus Pell mentioned it the way he mentioned everything, in a flat aside delivered to the horse he was working on, as if talking to himself, and she happened to be standing nearby. A party from the eastern cities putting together a bighorn hunt in the high country above the ridge, needing a hand who knew the drainages and could manage a pack string at altitude. $4 for the trip, meals included. She set down the curry brush and walked to the yard behind the assay office where the expedition was loading its animals. Harlan Voss was easy to find. He stood at the center of the activity with the relaxed authority of a man who knew exactly what he wanted and had the money to arrange it. 44 years old, broad across the shoulders, with a short dark beard trimmed too neatly for a mountain expedition and a canvas coat that was precisely the wrong color for the high country in late August. Too pale. The coat of a man who ordered from a catalog written by someone who had never stood above timberline in a wind. She waited at the gate until he noticed her. He walked over and looked at her the way men in that country looked at a young woman standing alone at a gate, with limited interest and a specific variety of assessment that was not quite hostile, but landed somewhere she had learned to manage without letting it cost her anything. She told him what she could do: cook, pack a mule, dress game, navigate the drainages in country that most hired hands had never seen past the first 2 valleys. He said not impolitely that she was selling herself fairly high for someone he had never heard of. She said her grandfather had ranged this country for 30 years and taught her every drainage within a day's ride of the ridge. He paused. Then he said the name the way people say the name of a place they have heard about second or third hand: James Calloway of Ridgeback Valley. She said yes. He looked at her a moment with something that was not quite recognition and not quite calculation but sat in the neighborhood of both. Then he offered $4 and her meals, responsible for the horses at night, nothing more in the budget. She agreed without bargaining because $4 was $4, and the high country in late August was the closest thing to home she had left. She did not say this. She said it only to herself in the back of her mind where James's voice still lived, and she shook Harlan Voss's hand and went back to the livery to gather her things. That evening she thought about the moment his offer had shifted, the pause before he named James Calloway, the slight recalibration in how he held himself after she confirmed it. She thought about the way he had used her first name once during the logistics conversation that followed, casually, in the middle of a sentence about the pack string rotation. Nora. Dropped in passing like a piece of furniture that had always been there. She had not given him her first name. She noted this and carried it forward in the careful internal ledger she kept of things that did not add up, and she thought about it that night in the stall, with the horses breathing around her, and she filed it alongside the postmark on Aldous Crane's letter, and the specific efficiency with which Birch Rowe had produced his paperwork, and she held all three pieces in the same pocket of her mind, and did not draw conclusions she could not yet support. They rode out of Ashford Falls 4 mornings later at first light. 5 riders, 8 animals, the aspens along the creek, already turning at their tips, thin yellow that would spread downslope through September. Nora rode at the back of the string with her bundle lashed behind the cantle and James's coat over her lap in the early cold, and the country opened ahead of her gray and green and vast in the morning light. She was going home. She understood this even as she understood that the home she was riding toward was not the one that had been taken. It was the older home, the one made of elevation and granite, and the quality of light above the tree line that she had first learned to love at 19 on a gray mare behind a man who pointed out landmarks she would need later. The one made of knowing where you are when the rest of the world has stopped telling you. She watched Harlan Voss during the 4 days of climbing. Not openly. The way James had taught her to watch country, in peripheral vision, through the accumulation of small details that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. The way Voss's eyes moved when he thought no one was watching. The low conversations with one of the men from the east, a narrow fellow named Langford, that ended not with the naturalness of ordinary talk but with the settling of 2 men reaching the edge of something agreed upon and stepping back from it. She noted all of this in her internal ledger and carried it forward and did not act because action requires more information than observation, and she was still in the observation stage. On the 4th morning, Voss asked her to ride north into a drainage shown on their hand-drawn map as promising territory for Bighorn. She looked at the map. The drainage shown bore no relationship to the actual country north of their camp, which she knew from riding through it 2 years ago, with James on a late September day when the aspens had been fully gold and the light had been the amber of high-altitude fall. The map showed a wide-open valley. What was actually north of them was a box canyon walled in on 3 sides by scree that no animal would cross voluntarily. But she folded the map and handed it back and said she would check it and be back within 2 hours. She was back in exactly that time. The canyon was empty, she reported. No sign of sheep. Not viable, the camp was empty. All 8 animals. All 5 riders, her bundle, James's coat from the saddlebag of the black mare. All of it gone south, the tracks reading clean in the soft ground at the edge of the tree line. She stood on the ridge and read the tracks and understood, and she turned east. She had been right to turn east. She stood in a cabin that should not have been on any map and had not been, and she held a compass engraved with her grandfather's initials in the palm of her hand, and the fire she had built from dry lodgepole ticked in the stove that Samuel Pratt had set his pipe into in the spring of 1866, and that had been waiting here ever since, cold and patient and entirely intact. She had been left on the mountain by men who thought the mountain would finish the accounting they had started. What they had not accounted for was the mountain itself, and what it had been holding for someone patient enough to walk all the way to the bottom of the right ravine and look. She put the compass in the inside pocket of the coat, where her hand could find it without looking, and she went to the spring, and she came back inside, and she laid herself down on Samuel Pratt's bed, and she slept without dreaming, which was the first time she had done that in 2 years, and outside the cabin the bench lay quiet under the late August stars, and the spring ran over its stones in the dark, and the ravine held its silence the way it had always held it. The way ground holds things when the right person finally arrives to receive them. She had come off a mountain with a sack of clothes and $11, and a coat that belonged to a dead man. She had walked 2 days through country that was trying to keep no secrets from her, only asking that she pay attention, which was the one thing she had always been willing to do. And she had found at the bottom of the right game trail, in a cabin above a spring that fed grass so green it looked impossible in late August, what 2 men had been saving for her across 40 years without knowing her name. The ground had kept it. The ground keeps. And sometimes, for the person willing to walk far enough and look honestly at what the tracks are saying, it gives back exactly what was set aside for them, no more and no less, in the season when they need it most. She came into Ashford Falls from the north at mid-morning, which was not how she had come out of it 2 weeks before. The trail she had followed down from the high country joined the main road a 1/4 mile above the livery, and she walked the last stretch on the packed dirt of the wagon road with the mountains at her back and the town spread out ahead of her in the thin September light. It looked smaller than she remembered. Towns always look smaller when you come back to them from the high country, as if the mountains recalibrate the eye to a scale that ordinary human construction cannot match. She passed the livery first. Gus Pell was in the yard working a hitch trace with a leather punch, and he looked up when she passed and gave a single nod of the kind that acknowledges a person without requiring anything further. She nodded back. He returned to the trace. That was the entire transaction, and it was the right kind. She went to the marshal's office before she went anywhere else. This was the order she had decided on during the last 2 miles of walking, and she kept to it. Cal Decker's office was at the south end of the main street, a frame building with a covered porch and a bench along the front wall, where men sometimes sat in the afternoon and talked about nothing in particular. The door was open. She knocked on the frame and stepped in. The office was what she had expected from a man who lived alone and took his work seriously. A desk with papers arranged in a specific order that was not tidiness for its own sake, but the arrangement of someone who needed to find things quickly. A wood stove in the corner, cold at this hour of the morning. A rifle rack along the wall behind the desk, 4 rifles clean and seated properly. A green ledger book open on the desk with a pen resting in the groove of the binding. Cal Decker himself was standing at the window on the far side of the room with a coffee cup in his hand, looking at the street, and he turned when she came in. 51 years old. A face that had been made by years of outdoor work into something angular and weathered and precise. The mustache was gray and well kept. The eyes were a particular shade of faded blue that she associated with men who had spent considerable time deciding what to pay attention to and had become good at the selection. He had been a marshal for 11 years and a widower for 9, and both of these things were present in him in the way formative experiences tend to be, not announced but structural. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his coffee down on the edge of the desk and gestured to the chair across from it. She sat. She told him what had happened. She told it in the order it had occurred, without editorializing, starting with Harlan Voss's offer in the yard behind the assay office, and ending with the tracks in the soft ground at the edge of the camp on the 4th day, all of it rendered in the plain sequential language of a report rather than a complaint. Cal Decker listened without interrupting. He had the quality of stillness that comes to people who have learned that interrupting a witness costs more than it earns, and he held it throughout, his pen moving occasionally in the green ledger. When she finished, he asked her to repeat the name twice. Harlan Voss. He wrote it each time with the deliberate pressure of a man making sure the letters were right. She said that Voss had known her name before she gave it to him in the yard, and she told him how she knew this, the single use of her first name in the logistics conversation that followed the hiring, casual, dropped in passing like a piece of furniture that had always been there. Cal Decker's pen stopped moving. He looked at the ledger for a moment, then at her. He said he had suspected the party from the east of business other than sheep. Said it quietly, as a statement of existing knowledge rather than a deduction she had prompted. Said he would ride out and look into it. She believed him. Not because he was authoritative or because his office lent him credibility, but because of the specific quality of his stillness when she told him about the name. A man who hears something he already half suspected goes still in a particular way. the stillness of a piece fitting into a larger picture he has been assembling for longer than this conversation. Cal Decker went still in exactly that way, and she understood that she was not the first thread he had been following in the direction of Harlan Voss. She thanked him and stood. He said he would need to know where she could be reached. She told him she was filing a homestead claim on a parcel in the high country east of the main ridge, and would be working that land, and that any word he had could be left with Gus Pell at the livery, and would reach her. He wrote this down. She left. The land office was 3 buildings north of the marshal's office, a narrow room with a high counter and shelves of rolled survey maps behind it. The clerk was a man named Ted Marsh, thin as a fence rail with a green eye shade that made his face look slightly jaundiced in the morning light. He had the patient, near expressionless quality of a man who has processed enough paperwork to have stopped being surprised by any of it. He pulled the relevant survey sections from the shelf and spread them on the counter, and they went through the parcel together, her describing the bench and the ravine and the spring and the approximate elevations, him locating the corresponding sections on the survey. The land was there. The coordinates she described fell within a section that had never been entered in any patent book he had record of, unregistered by any party for any purpose. He confirmed this twice, tracing the lines with the tip of his pen, and then he set out the filing forms. The fee was $1.75. She paid it from the folded currency in her boot, the original $11 she had carried down from James's cabin, and she watched Ted Marsh record the claim in his ledger in his careful clerk's hand. Every stroke deliberate and unhurried, the permanent record of a fact being made in real time. He stamped the registration form with the office seal and slid a copy across the counter to her. She folded it carefully and put it inside the ledger against her body under the coat. She stepped out of the land office onto the boardwalk and had walked perhaps 15 steps north toward Frank Aldridge's Mercantile when she saw him. Aldous Crane was coming out of Martha Good's hotel on the opposite side of the street. He had Birch Rowe at his left shoulder and a third man at his right, someone she had not seen before, a compact man in a dark blue vest, with the particular erectness of posture that comes from being in rooms where posture matters. An Eastern lawyer, or she would eat the hat she did not own. The 3 of them paused on the hotel steps in a moment of ordinary conversation, and then Aldous Crane looked up the street the way a man looks when he has the instinct of someone whose plans are running as intended, and he saw her. He stopped talking, not dramatically, not with the suddenness of shock. He stopped with the measured control of a man whose face does not do things without his permission, and for 2 or 3 seconds, he simply looked at her across the width of the main street with an expression she had to examine carefully to read. It was not surprise in the way of someone confronted with the impossible. It was something closer to the recalibration of a person whose calculations have turned up an unexpected variable. His plan had included her being gone from this town. She was not gone. This was a data point that required processing. Then he smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and proportioned, the kind of smile that a person deploys when they want to communicate warmth without actually feeling any. He said something to Birch Rowe, quiet enough that it did not carry across the street, and Birch Rowe's eyes moved to the land office she had just come out of and stayed there for a beat too long. Then the lawyer in the blue vest received some version of the same message, and all 3 of them adjusted their orientation in a way that was subtle enough to be deniable and clear enough to be unmistakable. Nora kept walking north toward the Mercantile. Frank Aldridge's store occupied the largest building on the north half of the main street, a broad-fronted establishment with a full porch and 2 display windows that showed an arrangement of dry goods on one side and hardware on the other. Frank Aldridge himself was behind the counter when she came in, a man of 46 with the broad, careful hands of someone who has worked with them his entire life, and a face that wore its reserve the way some men wear good coats, habitually, not because the day requires it, but because taking it off feels like more trouble than keeping it on. He nodded when she came through the door. She worked through her list methodically. Flour, salt, coffee, lard, 6 boxes of matches, 2 wool blankets, a small hatchet, a whetstone finer than the one on Samuel Pratt's shelf. She asked to see the used firearms, and he brought out 3 rifles from the case behind the counter, laid them on the glass, and stepped back while she looked at them. She picked up the 3rd one, a lever action with a 30-inch barrel that had been used but maintained with care, the action smooth and the bore clean. She worked the lever twice and dry-fired it and found it right. She bought it and 2 boxes of cartridges. She put one of the double eagles on the counter. Frank Aldridge picked it up and turned it over once, the way you turn over a coin that is unfamiliar in your hand, checking the weight and the face. His hands were steady. He set the coin on the scale, weighed it, and made change from the drawer without commentary. She arranged for a pack horse and a mule to be delivered to the North Trailhead by the following morning. Frank Aldridge gave her the name of a freighter, a man called Darnell Hatch who operated out of the livery on contract, and said it could be arranged for a fair rate. She said she would see Hatch that afternoon. She picked up the rifle and the supplies and walked out onto the boardwalk. Martha Good was standing outside the hotel door across the street, her silver blonde hair neat despite the wind, her hands holding a cloth over her apron, as if she had come out to shake it and then forgotten the purpose. She was looking at Nora with an expression that was harder to read than Aldous Crane's had been, because it did not have a clear calculation behind it. It was a face doing several things at once, recognition and something that might have been reassessment, and something underneath both of those that was older and less tidy. Then Martha Good stepped off the hotel porch and crossed the street. She came without hurry, and without the particular deliberateness of someone who has made a dramatic decision. She came the way a woman crosses a street when she has decided something privately and wants to finish the motion before she can talk herself out of it. She stopped in front of Nora and held out the cloth she had been carrying, and inside it was a parcel of biscuits and cold sliced beef, still warm from the morning. She did not explain it. She said only, with the brevity of someone who finds explanation unnecessary, she had heard about the Callaway land. She had known James for 12 years. She thought a person who had spent 2 winters keeping his place deserved something better than what she had offered on that first morning. Nora took the parcel. She said thank you in a way that required no response. Martha Good looked at her for a moment longer, then nodded once and crossed back to her hotel. Nora stood on the boardwalk and ate the biscuits while she walked toward the livery to find Darnell Hatch, because she was hungry and biscuits did not improve with waiting. She was arranging the terms with Hatch, a lean man of 50 with the sunburned forearms of someone who spent his life outdoors, and the economical speech of a man who charges by the word, when Roy Sutton came around the corner of the livery with a horseshoe in each hand and stopped when he saw her. Roy was the blacksmith, his shop 2 lots south, a man of 40 built like the work he did, broad and dense and permanently marked by fire, in ways that had become simply part of his appearance. He looked at her and looked at the pack setup she was arranging with Hatch and said that he would shoe the pack horse and the mule before the morning if she needed it done. She said she would pay him for the work. He shook his head, and his voice carried the specific flatness of a man delivering a fact rather than a sentiment. James Callaway had once spent 2 hours pulling Roy's best draft horse out of a creek in a November storm, and had refused payment on the grounds that any man would have done the same, which Roy had known to be a polite fiction but had accepted, and the account had been sitting open for 4 years. He would like to close it. She said she understood, and she meant it, not in the way of social agreement, but in the genuine way of a person who recognizes the language of accounts kept between people who take obligations seriously. It was the same language James had spoken. It was not a language Aldous Crane spoke, or Birch Rowe, or Harlan Voss. It was the language of people for whom a debt is a real thing that lives in the world and requires eventual settlement. She went back to the stall at the livery with her supplies, and sat on her bedroll and loaded the rifle and set it against the wall and thought about the order in which things would need to happen. It was late afternoon when the knock came on the livery wall beside the stall entrance. Not the direct knock of someone with authority and the confidence to announce themselves. The careful knock of someone who has thought about whether to knock at all and decided in favor of it only at the last moment. Aldous Crane came around the partition alone, without Birch Rowe and without the Easton lawyer, and this was itself information. He had chosen to have this conversation without witnesses. He was 60 years old in a good coat and clean boots, and he moved with the ease of a man who was accustomed to rooms being arranged to his advantage before he arrived in them. He said pleasantly that he was glad to see she had come through the business in the high country without harm. He said it with a specific quality of relief in his voice that was precise enough to be performance. He said that family should be able to speak plainly to one another, and that he hoped they could. She looked at him and waited. He said that the law regarding found property on land with a complex ownership history was not always straightforward, that a person in her position would benefit from an arrangement rather than a legal proceeding, which tended to be expensive and slow and uncertain in its outcomes, that he was prepared to be generous, understanding the difficulty of her circumstances, and that a quiet settlement would serve everyone's interests, including hers. She held the quiet for 3 seconds after he finished. Then she said what she had thought on the ridge with the empty tracks at her feet, the thing that had arranged itself into words somewhere in the 2-day walk down from the mountains. The parcel she had filed on this morning had never appeared in any patent record, and had not been within the boundary of James Calloway's 80 acres by any survey she had seen, and what was found on land properly filed and duly recorded belonged to the person who had filed it. She said this without anger. Anger was not the instrument the situation required. Aldous Crane's expression did not change. The pleasantness stayed in place like a coat he had decided not to take off regardless of the temperature inside. He said she was a young woman with no legal representation and no family, and that he wished her well, but that the courts in this territory had a particular view of unaccompanied claims, and that she should think carefully before she decided she did not need his help. She said, "The map does not know what the courts think of it, and neither does the land." He looked at her for a moment. The pleasantness receded a fraction, not all the way, just enough to show the edge of what was underneath it. Then he put his hat back on his head and walked out of the livery, and she listened to his boots on the packed ground until the sound of them was gone, and then she sat in the quiet with the rifle across her knees and thought about what he had said and what he had not said. What he had not said was anything that required new information. He had used no detail that was not already in the public record. He had not mentioned the ravine specifically. He had not mentioned the bench, or the spring, or Samuel Pratt, or anything found below the hearthstones. Either he did not know these things, or he was choosing not to show that he knew them. Both possibilities were worth holding. She slept that night at the livery and was up before light and had her supplies loaded on the pack horse and the mule, both freshly shod courtesy of Roy Sutton, and was moving north out of Ashford Falls before the main street showed any activity beyond the lamp in the bakery window and the first gray smoke from the hotel kitchen chimney. She moved at a good pace. The animals were fresh, and the morning was cold and clear, and she felt the particular sharpening that comes from being back on a trail, with a specific destination in mind. The bench and the spring and the cabin were hers in a way that the 80 acres of Ridgeback Valley had never been, because they had been found rather than given, and because what you find by your own effort has a different quality of belonging than what is assigned to you by someone else's generosity. James had not given her the land. He had given her the knowledge to find something better. She reached the cabin in the early afternoon of the second day. The bench was exactly as she had left it, the door latched on the pine needle threshold, the star above it unchanged. She unloaded the animals and turned them into the upper meadow where the grass was good and the tree line made a natural fence on 3 sides. She rebuilt the fire. She hung the 2 new blankets to air on the line she strung between the corner of the cabin and the nearest spruce. She sat at Samuel Pratt's table that evening, with the firelight moving on the walls and the ledger open in front of her and the sealed envelope beside it. She had not opened the envelope yet. She was not sure entirely why she had not. Perhaps because she had read the ledger and understood Samuel Pratt's quality of mind well enough to know that what was inside the envelope would require her full attention, and she had not had full attention available since she found it. Every hour since had been occupied by movement and logistics and the management of immediate problems. Tonight there were no immediate problems. The door was barred. The rifle was loaded and leaning against the wall where she could reach it from the bed. The animals were safe in the upper meadow. The claim was filed. The marshal knew what he needed to know. She picked up the envelope and slid the point of the folding knife under the flap and opened it cleanly. The letter was written on 2 sheets of heavy paper in Samuel Pratt's careful upright hand, the same hand as the ledger entries but slower, each word placed with the deliberateness of a man who knows this is the last document he will produce and wants it right. He began by stating his full name and his service record and the date, December of 1884. He stated that in the spring of 1864, he had been ordered by Colonel Hadley to cache a supply of army stores and specie at 9 locations in the high country, north of what was then called Ridge Station, against a planned campaign movement that was subsequently cancelled when the strategic situation changed. He stated that at the end of the war he had reported the existence of the cache to his commanding officer and had been told to disregard it, that the matter was handled, and that subsequent inquiry suggested no action had ever been taken to recover the stores, which had been reclassified and written off in the confusion of demobilization. He had kept the location of Site 9 to himself. He had not kept it out of dishonesty. He had kept it because the money had been in the ground for 3 years by then, and no one had come for it, and because the men who had ordered it cached had, in his judgment, forfeited any claim they had through negligence, and because he was 39 years old and had survived 4 years of a war that had killed better men than him, and had decided he was going to live the remainder of his life somewhere quiet and on his own terms. He had built the cabin, he had trapped and cut wood, and watched 20 winters come and go and watched Ranger die in the 11th one, and had written Sarah's name in his ledger once a year on the anniversary of the last time he had seen her and had never written it anywhere else. He wrote that over the 19 years on the bench he had added to the cash from his own trapping proceeds, setting aside a portion of every season's earnings. He had no wife, no children, no kin worth the mention. The money in the ground had become, over time, a mixture of what the army had deposited and what he had accumulated by his own work, and the mixture had grown to the point where the army's portion was a minority of the whole. He wrote that he was leaving everything in the box to whoever found it in a state of need, because need was the only qualification that mattered to him at this point in his accounting, and because a man who has spent 19 years alone has learned something about what a person requires in order to build a life, and it is not complicated, but it does require a floor to stand on. Then he wrote the line she would return to more than any other in the years that followed. It is harder to leave things to strangers than people suppose, because you cannot know who they are or what they will do with what you give them. But I have found that I trust need more than I trust character, because need is honest in a way that character is not always, and because whoever is standing in this cabin cold and hungry and without many options has already demonstrated the one quality I care most about, which is that they kept going. She set the letter down and looked at the fire. Then she turned to the second page, which was shorter. He wrote that he had in his keeping a brass compass belonging to a man named James Calloway, scout, who had sheltered with his detachment during the river crossing of November 1863, and who had left the compass in Samuel's keeping during a night march with the understanding that he would retrieve it within the week. James Calloway had not come back within the week. Samuel had heard later that he had gotten through and made his way home, and he had been glad of this. He had looked for James Calloway for 20 years in the limited way available to a man who does not go to towns and does not ask questions of strangers. He had not found him. He left the compass in the box with the hope that it would find its way to someone who understood its value, and with an apology to James Calloway for keeping it so long. Nora folded the letter along its original creases. She set it back inside the envelope. She took the brass compass out of the inside pocket of James's coat and held it in her palm and looked at the engraving in the firelight. J.C. 1863. Her grandfather's hands had held this object in the winter of the year she was trying to picture, crossing a mountain river in November in the dark, handing it to a quartermaster's clerk for safekeeping, fully intending to come back for it. He had not come back, but he had gotten home, and somehow, in a chain of events that spanned 40 years and required her to lose everything and walk 2 days through the high country, the compass had found its way back to the family it had started with. She thought about the kind of accounting that produced this outcome, the specific, improbable sequence of losses and arrivals that had deposited her, cold and hungry and without many options, on the threshold of the one place on the mountain that was waiting to be found by exactly someone in her condition. She did not think it was fate. She did not think in those terms, and James had not taught her to. She thought it was the accumulated consequence of two men being, separately and without knowledge of each other, the kind of people they were. Samuel Pratt, keeping the compass for 20 years, because returning it was the right thing to do, even when the opportunity for returning it had closed. James Calloway teaching her every drainage within a day's ride of the ridge, as if she would need to find her way back through them without him, because he had understood something she had not yet understood about the shape of what was coming. She stayed by the fire until it burned low. Then she went to bed. She was back in Ashford Falls 10 days later, down for supplies, when Cal Decker rode in from the north with Harlan Voss tied at the wrist to his saddle horn, and 2 other men from the original expedition under similar arrangements following behind. The third man from the party had, by Cal Decker's account, ridden south into open country and not come out of it, and his fate was a matter Cal Decker said he would pursue but was not optimistic about. Voss looked at nothing in particular as they came down the main street, not at Nora, who was standing outside Frank Aldridge's mercantile with a sack of flour over one shoulder. He had the specific blank quality of a man who has already made his calculation and found that the outcome he feared most has arrived, and that there is now nothing to do but sit in it. She watched him pass without expression. Cal Decker handed her back her possessions from a canvas bag on the pack animal. James's Bible wrapped in cloth, the tin box from the mantel at Ridgeback Valley, its hasp intact, the iron skillet with the long handle and the hairline crack in the lip that she had cooked on for 2 years without it worsening. All of it recovered from a room above a saloon in a settlement 2 valleys south, which told her something about how long the plan had been in motion and how well it had been mapped out in advance. She took the Bible and the tin box and the skillet and put them in the supplies she was loading for the trip back up the mountain. Cal Decker stopped beside her before he went on to his office. He said, without elaborate preamble, that Harlan Voss had not organized the expedition independently. He said that the direction from which Voss had received his instructions was a matter he was still working on, but that certain things had become clearer in the past 10 days, and that she should know the situation was not finished. She said she understood. She said she would be on the bench if he needed to reach her. He looked at her for a moment in the level way that was characteristic of him. He said, James Calloway was a man this town did not do well by while he was alive, meaning they had not paid him the attention his quality warranted. He hoped the town would do better by the people he had left behind. She thought about the word behind him, left behind by him. She was not sure it was the right preposition. She felt more like something James had left ahead of himself, a fact he had prepared and sent forward into the future where it would be needed. She did not say this to Cal Decker. She just nodded once and went back to her loading. What Cal Decker had told her was not a surprise, exactly. She had known from the postmark on Aldous Crane's letter that the operation against her had been planned in advance of James's death. She had known from Harlan Voss's easy use of her name in the hiring conversation that someone had briefed him on who she was and what she lacked. She had known from Birch Row's eyes moving to the land office that the strategy against her homestead claim had been prepared before she walked into town. None of these things required an elaborate leap of inference. They were plain in the available evidence if you were willing to look at evidence plainly. What she had not known until now was that Cal Decker had been looking at the same evidence from his own direction. That while she had been walking east in the dark with a saddle blanket over her shoulders, a marshal in a small town had been adding her situation to a file he had already been building. The convergence of their separate understandings was not dramatic. It did not produce a revelation or a climax. It produced only the quiet increment of advantage that comes from discovering you are not as alone in a situation as you believed. She loaded the last of the supplies and started north out of Ashford Falls for the 3rd time, the pack horse and the mule moving steadily behind her, and she thought about what Cal Decker had said about the situation not being finished. She thought about Aldous Crane in his good coat and his good boots with his lawyer in the blue vest and his file of documents that Birch Row had prepared with care. She thought about the land office registration folded inside the ledger inside the coat. She thought about the letter in Samuel Pratt's careful hand, 2 sheets of heavy paper, every word placed with the deliberateness of a man writing the last document he would ever write. The situation was not finished. She agreed with Cal Decker on that. But she had things now that she had not had 2 weeks ago. A roof, a claim, a rifle, a marshal who was paying attention. And a letter from a dead man that was, if she read it correctly, as close to a legal document as a person writing alone in a cabin in 1884 with no lawyer and no notary could produce. She was 22 years old, and she had been counted as nothing from the beginning, by every person who had a stake in counting her as nothing. She was aware of this. She did not resent it in the hot, consuming way that demands immediate address. She filed it in the same ledger, where she filed everything else that was true about her situation, and she carried it forward into the country ahead of her. Useful information about the terrain she was moving through. The mountains came back into view as she climbed north out of the valley, first as shapes against the sky, then as the full articulated presence of peaks and ridges, and the high timber below them, going gold at the edges as September moved through. She watched them come back the way you watch for a landmark you have been navigating toward, with the satisfaction of arrival rather than the anxiety of approach. She was going home. The word had a different weight now than it had carried 2 weeks ago. Then it had been a word with a hollow in the middle where something used to be. Now it was solid all the way through, registered in Ted Marsh's ledger at the land office, staked by her own filing fee, confirmed by the springs and the bench and the squared lodgepole logs that Samuel Pratt had cut and fitted by hand in the spring of 1866, and that had stood through 20 winters waiting for someone to come down the game trail and find them. The pack horse moved steadily behind her. The mule moved steadily behind the pack horse. The trail climbed north and east, and the smell of the high country came down to meet her, pine resin and cold and the clean particular smell of altitude, and she walked into it with her shoulders straight and the rifle in the saddle scabbard, and James's compass in the inside pocket of James's coat over her heart, where her hand could find it without looking. The legal document arrived on the bench in the 3rd week of October, carried up by Darnell Hatch along with a bag of cornmeal and a crate of winter candles that Nora had arranged for in advance of the cold. Hatch left the supplies at the trailhead as agreed and rode back down without comment, and she packed them up to the cabin on the mule in 2 loads, and it was on the 2nd load that she found the envelope tucked between the candles and the cornmeal, sealed with wax and addressed in a hand she did not recognize. She set it on Samuel Pratt's table and finished unloading and got the animals settled and built up the fire and made coffee before she opened it. Not because she was afraid of it, because she had learned to finish the necessary work before attending to the uncertain work, and the animals needed tending regardless of what any envelope contained. The document inside was 4 pages long and written in the dense, airless language of legal proceedings, the kind of language designed to make ordinary facts sound immovable. She read it twice slowly, translating it into plain sense as she went. Aldous Crane, acting through his attorney of record, a man named Hargreave, whose office was listed as being in a city 200 miles east, was filing a civil claim against the homestead registration she had recorded with Ted Marsh. The claim rested on 2 arguments. The first was that the bench and ravine, while not within the original surveyed boundary of James Calloway's 80 acres, fell within what the filing called the customary use area of the Calloway property, meaning land that James had regularly used, and that should therefore be considered part of his estate. The second argument was more direct and more dangerous. It stated that any property discovered on land with a contested heritage passed, under territorial law, to the party with the strongest prior claim to the surrounding parcels, and that Aldous Crane, as heir to the Calloway estate, held that claim. It was a lawyer's document. It had the quality of a net, designed not to be right so much as to be sufficiently complicated to require untangling, and untangling required time and money and legal representation, all of which Aldous Crane possessed and Nora Calloway did not. She recognized the strategy. She had seen it in simpler form when Birch Rowe had sat at James's table and listed the items she could keep. The careful deployment of official language to make a predetermined outcome seem like the natural operation of neutral rules. She set the document beside Samuel Pratt's letter on the table and looked at them together for a long time. The document was 4 pages of dense professional language. The letter was 2 pages of careful personal honesty. She thought about which of the 2 would matter more in the room where this was going to be decided, and she was not certain of the answer. And uncertainty was the correct response to the situation, because certainty at this stage would mean she was not thinking clearly. She wrote a letter to Cal Decker that evening, 2 pages in her own plain hand, describing the document and asking whether there was a hearing scheduled and if so, when and where. She sent it down with the mule the following morning, via the arrangement she had made with Gus Pell at the livery, who took in messages from the mountain parcels as a sideline to his regular work. She trusted Gus Pell's reliability because James had trusted it, and because James had been a good judge of reliable men. The reply came back in 4 days. Cal Decker's handwriting was angular and spare, Each letter formed with the same economy he brought to everything else. He wrote that a hearing had been scheduled at the district courthouse in Heartland County for the 15th of November, which was 5 weeks away. He wrote that the document was consistent with a pattern he had been observing in Aldous Crane's business dealings in the southern part of the territory, where similar filings had preceded the acquisition of 3 other properties in the past 7 years. He wrote that he had spoken with Ted Marsh and that the homestead registration was properly recorded and would hold against the first argument, but that the second argument regarding found property was less clear under current territorial statute. He wrote that she should consider finding legal representation, and that if cost was a problem, he knew a man in the county seat who took cases on contingency when he believed in the merits. She read the letter twice and then sat with the weight of the second argument, found property. The territorial statute on found property was not something she knew in detail, but she understood its general shape from conversations James had had with neighboring ranchers over the years, the way a person absorbs the outline of a legal landscape they inhabit without ever formally studying it. Found property on unregistered land reverted to prior claim if the land itself was contested. She had filed the homestead claim. The homestead claim established her right to the bench and the ravine from the date of filing forward. But it said nothing about what had been in the ground before she arrived, and Aldous Crane's lawyer was specifically targeting that gap. She went back to Samuel Pratt's letter and read it again, not searching for comfort, searching for the thing that was already there but that she had not yet fully registered as the legal instrument it was. He had stated his name and his service and the date. He had stated the origin of the cash and its subsequent history. He had stated that he had added to it from his own earnings over 19 years. He had stated his intention to leave it to whoever found it in need. He had used, in the last paragraph of the first page, the specific phrase, "By this letter I do hereby assign and intend." She had read those words the first time and absorbed them as the language of a sincere man expressing a genuine wish. Reading them now, with Aldous Crane's 4-page filing beside them on the table, she understood that Samuel Pratt had written a will, an informal one, unwitnessed, unnotarized, written alone in a cabin in the winter of 1884 by a man who had no lawyer and no one to consult, and who had done the best he could with the instruments available to him. Whether it was sufficient under territorial law was exactly the question, and she did not know the answer with certainty. But she knew something else. She knew that the money Samuel Pratt had added to the cash over 19 years was not Army property. It was his, earned by his own work, trapped and sold and saved season by season, and his right to dispose of it as he chose was not contingent on any prior claim to the surrounding land. Whatever Aldous Crane could argue about the original Army stores, he could argue nothing about the 19 years of Samuel Pratt's accumulated earnings. Those were private property left by private will to a specific class of recipient, being a person in need, and she was that person and this was that need. She spent 2 days writing out a clear statement of this argument in her own language, working through the logic carefully and revising it until it was as airtight as she could make it without professional training. She sent it down to Cal Decker with a request that he pass it to the lawyer he had mentioned if the man was willing to look at it. Then she went back to work. October on the bench was a different country from September. The aspens in the ravine had gone entirely gold, and then, over the course of a single week of hard wind, bare. The meadow grass flattened and silvered with frost each morning, and did not fully recover during the day. She cut and split 4 cords of lodgepole from the dead timber along the upper edge of the tree line, working with the small hatchet and a wedge and a maul she had borrowed from Darnell Hatch, and she stacked it against the south wall of the cabin where it would stay dry under the roof overhang. She reinforced the lean-to shed against the west wall for the mule and the pack horse, adding a layer of peeled poles to the roof and banking the base with spruce boughs against the draft. She resealed the door with fresh chinking and checked every joint in the stovepipe for rust or separation and found one joint that had started to gap at the top and sealed it with furnace clay she had bought from Frank Aldridge on her last supply run. She was not idle because idleness was dangerous in this context, not physically but mentally. The mind left without work finds the worst possible use for itself, and she had seen this happen to people she respected, the slow corrosion of waiting without purpose. She worked instead. She made the cabin tight. She made the animals comfortable. She laid in enough wood to last through February, even if February was hard, and she began in the evenings to read through the entire ledger again, this time with a piece of paper beside her on which she noted every specific detail Samuel Pratt had recorded about his trapping income, the years and the amounts and the seasons, building the most complete picture she could of what 19 years of his earnings might represent in total. She was doing this on the 3rd week of October when the horses moved in the shed. Not the ordinary shifting of animals at rest, but the specific alert movement of creatures that have noticed something outside the shed walls. She set the ledger down. She picked up the rifle. She sat very still in the cabin and listened. Footsteps on the bench. One person, not trying to be quiet, which was either reassurance or a specific kind of threat. Then a knock on the cabin door. 2 measured raps. The knock of someone who has decided to announce themselves, because they are not afraid of the person inside. She unbarred the door with the rifle held at her side. The man outside was not anyone she had expected. He was in his mid-50s, heavy-set in the chest, with a round, ruddy face, and the specific combination of a good wool coat and worn-out boots that suggested his money went to professional appearance before personal comfort. He carried a leather document case in his right hand and had his hat in his left, which was either manners or strategy or both. He said his name was Clement Burr, and that he was an attorney practicing in Heartland County, and that Cal Decker had sent him up. He said he had read her written statement and found it interesting, and had ridden up from the county seat to look at the property and the documents in person before deciding whether to take the case. She stepped back from the door and let him in. He spent 2 hours at the table. He read Samuel Pratt's ledger from cover to cover, making occasional notes in a small book he carried in his coat pocket. He read the sealed letter 3 times, which told her something about what he was looking for and finding. He examined the army inventory sheet and the annotated map and the bundle of dispatches with the red string, handling each item with the careful fingers of a man who understood what documents were worth and treated them accordingly. He got down on one knee in front of the hearth and looked at the reseated stones and the pale mortar section and the tin-lined recess, and he stayed there looking for longer than she expected, which she took as a good sign. When he came back to the table, he sat down across from her and folded his hands on top of his notebook. He said that the informal will was a problem, not an insurmountable one but a real one, because the territorial court in Heartland County had a judge who held a strict view of formal requirements and who would need to be persuaded that the intent of the document overrode the absence of witnesses and notarization. He said the argument she had made in her written statement about the distinction between the army stores and Samuel Pratt's personal earnings was sound and was probably the strongest ground she had. He said the customary use argument in Aldous Crane's filing was weak, and he was not worried about it. He said the found property argument was the one that would determine the outcome. He looked at her steadily when he said the next thing, in the manner of a man who has decided to be honest rather than encouraging, which she respected. He said that Aldous Crane's lawyer was a skilled practitioner who had won similar cases in other territories on narrower grounds, and that she should go into the hearing without illusions about the difficulty of what she was facing. She said she had not had illusions about the difficulty of things in some time, and did not expect to develop them now. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said he would take the case. He named his contingency terms. If she prevailed, he would take 15% of the value of the found property as his fee. If she did not prevail, he would take nothing. He said this was the arrangement he used when he believed in the merits of a case, and in the character of the person bringing it, and that he believed in both here. She agreed to the terms. They shook hands across Samuel Pratt's table. Clement Burr spent the night in the cabin, sleeping in James's bedroll she had set up near the stove, and he rode back down the following morning with the original documents in his case, having made copies of everything in his small, precise handwriting before he left. She watched him ride out of the upper meadow and down the trail and disappear below the tree line. She stood in the meadow afterward for a few minutes in the cold morning air and looked at the mountains around the bench, the walls of the ravine rising on 2 sides and the open south slope dropping away toward the valley. The sky above the peaks was the hard, bright blue that October produced at this elevation, cloudless and sharp-edged and so clear it looked like something recently cleaned. She had stood in this spot perhaps 40 times since she arrived, and it still had the quality of a place she had not entirely finished believing was real. She went back inside and put the fire up and made breakfast and went to work. November came cold and early. The first snow fell on the bench on the 3rd of the month and stayed, 3 inches of dry powder that settled into the crannies of the stacked wood and made the cabin roof white, and turned the meadow into a clean surface that recorded every step of every animal that crossed it. She found the records useful in the way James had taught her to find animal sign useful, as information about what was moving through the country and when and with what purpose. What was moving through her country now was the approach of the 15th. She went down to Ashford Falls on the 12th to collect what she needed for the ride to the county seat, and the town had the particular quality of a place where people know something is happening and are watching to see how it resolves. Martha Good had a room set aside for her without being asked. Frank Aldridge had a package of provisions ready at the counter when she walked in, more than she had ordered, and he said only that the extra was on account. Roy Sutton was working in front of his shop when she passed, and he straightened up and took off his cap and held it in front of him for a moment, which was a gesture she understood as belonging to a category of sentiment that had no comfortable verbal form and was better expressed through a cap held in 2 hands. Gus Pell told her at the livery that Cal Decker had already ridden to Heartland County and was expected at the courthouse on the morning of the 15th. She rode to the county seat on the 13th, a full day's ride south on the main road, and arrived in the early evening and found the hotel Clement Burr had recommended, and took a room and ate supper in the dining room, and went to bed early because she needed sleep more than she needed to think, and she had done enough thinking to last through whatever tomorrow required. The Heartland County Courthouse was a 2-story stone building at the center of town, with a carved stone eagle above the entrance that had been eroded by weather until it looked more like a stout pigeon. She arrived 20 minutes early and found Clement Burr already inside, seated at the respondent's table with his document case open and his papers arranged. He looked up when she came in and gave a single nod of the professional kind that communicates readiness without requiring conversation. The room filled. Not a large room, perhaps 40 seats arranged in rows behind the bar, and by the time the clerk called the proceeding to order, perhaps 30 of them were occupied. She recognized Cal Decker in the second row on the left, his hat on his knee, his expression giving nothing away. She recognized Ted Marsh from the land office, which surprised her until she thought about it and realized that Ted Marsh was a man who kept his own account of the records he had made and might have come to see how they were used. She recognized, in the back row, Martha Good, who had apparently closed her hotel for the day and ridden an hour and a half to sit in a courtroom for a hearing that did not concern her in any direct way. Martha Good was looking at the front of the room with the calm, unhurried attention of someone who has decided to be present for something important and is not going to perform that presence for anyone. Aldous Crane was at the claimant's table with his lawyer. Hargreave was perhaps 50 years old, with a face made primarily for projecting professional certainty, and he arranged his papers with the ease of a man on familiar ground. Aldous Crane did not look at Nora when she sat down at the respondent's table. He looked at the judge's bench, and then at his lawyer, and then at a point somewhere slightly left of everything, which was where a man looks when he has decided that confidence requires not acknowledging the opposition. Birch Rowe was in the front row of the gallery, behind Aldous Crane's table. He was wearing his pressed vest, and he was sitting very still, and he had the look of a man who has come to see something concluded, and is not entirely comfortable with the nature of his own presence at the conclusion. Judge Walter Oakes came in and sat and did not waste time on preamble. He was in his 60s, broad-shouldered, with a short white beard, and the manner of a man who has been in this room long enough to have stopped being interested in theater. He read through the filing and the registration and the response that Clement Burr had submitted, and he looked up over his reading glasses and said that he wanted to hear from both sides on the question of the found property statute and that he wanted the argument kept to the substance. Hargreave went first. He was smooth and organized, his argument building in clean layers, and she listened to it carefully, because you learn more about a threat by listening to it than by preparing your response while it is speaking. He acknowledged the homestead registration. He did not contest it. He focused entirely on the found property, arguing that the territorial statute on discovered assets was unambiguous property found on land within the contested heritage of an established estate, passed to the party with the prior and senior claim to the surrounding territory. He argued that James Calloway's use of the high country north of his property was established by witness testimony he was prepared to produce, and that Aldous Crane, as heir to the Calloway estate, therefore held prior claim to anything discovered on that land regardless of who had discovered it. He said nothing about Samuel Pratt. This was interesting. He had read the response Clement Burr had filed. He knew about the letter and the ledger and the argument about personal earnings. He had chosen to argue around it, rather than against it, which meant either he thought the argument was weaker than it was, or he thought the judge could be kept away from it. Clement Burr stood when it was his turn. He had a different quality in the courtroom than he had had in the cabin, the same calm but organized around a different axis, professional rather than collegial, precise in a way that came from knowing exactly what mattered and discarding everything that did not. He began with the homestead registration and established it cleanly in 60 seconds. He moved to the found property statute and read from it directly, the actual statutory language, which was denser and more conditional than Hargreaves' summary had suggested. He noted that the statute applied to discovered property on unregistered land, and that the bench and the ravine were now registered land, which complicated the application in ways the statute itself did not clearly resolve. Then he made the argument she had first worked out alone at Samuel Pratt's table in October. He read from the ledger, not all of it, specific entries dated, each one recording a season's trapping income and the amount set aside. He read from the letter the passage about adding to the cash from personal earnings over 19 years. He cited territorial inheritance law, not found property law, the right of an individual to dispose of personal property by stated intent regardless of the location in which that property was kept. He said that the question before the court was not what had been found, or where it had been found, but whose it was when it was found, and that 19 years of documented personal savings left by stated intent to a recipient who met the stated criteria was not found property in the legal sense. It was inheritance, and inheritance passed to the person named. Nora had been named. Not by her own name, but she had been named by the criteria that described her, a person in need who had found the ledger and come to the cabin in that condition, and who had demonstrated, by continuing to exist and function in circumstances designed to make both difficult, exactly the quality Samuel Pratt had specified as his requirement. Judge Oakes listened to all of this without expression. When Clement Burr finished, the judge looked at Hargreave and asked him to address the personal earnings argument directly. Hargreave did. He argued that the letter was not a legal will, under territorial statute, because it lacked witnesses and notarization, that the personal earnings could not be distinguished from the army stores by any means available to the court, and that commingled property of disputed provenance reverted to the strongest prior claim, which was his client's. Judge Oakes said he would review the documents and return with his determination after the noon recess. The room went to a lower register of sound, the shuffling of people readjusting themselves in their seats, the murmur of private conversation. Nora sat at the respondent's table and looked at her hands on the table surface, and thought about the argument and about where it was strong and where it was not. The commingling problem was real. She could see it clearly. If the court decided that Samuel Pratt's personal earnings and the original army stores could not be separated in practice, then the entire cash became a single item of contested provenance, and Hargreaves' argument had traction. Clement Burr had done everything right. The outcome was not certain. It was during the recess that Birch Rowe did what he did. She had gone to the hallway outside the courtroom to stand in the cooler air and think, and Cal Decker had come out shortly after and stood a few feet away without speaking, which was a form of company she appreciated. She heard the door open again, and turned and saw Birch Rowe come into the hall with his pressed vest and his careful hands, and his expression of a man who has made a calculation he does not entirely like, but has made it nonetheless. He said he needed to speak to the marshal. He said it directly, without preamble, looking at Cal Decker, not at Nora. He said there was a matter relating to certain documents that he had prepared at the instruction of Aldous Crane, and that he believed the court should have access to information he had not previously disclosed. Cal Decker looked at him for a moment with the specific quality of a man receiving a thing he has been expecting and not allowing the expectation to show as surprise. He said Birch Rowe should come to the clerk's office and say what he had to say in front of a recorder. Birch Rowe went. She watched him go. She did not feel triumphant about it. She felt the specific, sober understanding of what it looked like when a man chose the option that protected himself over the option that protected his employer, and she recognized it for what it was. Not courage and not conscience, but the arithmetic of self-preservation, arriving at the correct answer by the wrong route. What Birch Rowe told the court recorder in the clerk's office was this: that the document he had prepared for Aldous Crane's filing, the one that cited James Calloway's customary use of the high country north of his property, contained a signature that Birch Rowe had dated 2 weeks before James Calloway died, but that had in fact been signed by James Calloway 6 months earlier in a different context, a routine boundary confirmation that had nothing to do with the high country claim. He had taken that signature and applied it to a different document. He had falsified the date and the context. He had done this because Aldous Crane had asked him to, and because Aldous Crane's business was a significant portion of Birch Rowe's income, and because he had told himself at the time that the underlying claim was probably valid, regardless of how the documentation was assembled. He said this last thing in a flat voice that did not ask for understanding, but that was honest about the reasoning in a way that took a particular kind of nerve, or perhaps simply the nerve of a man who has nothing left to protect, and so stops protecting himself from his own accounting. Cal Decker had the filed document in front of him, and he compared the signature on it to the original boundary confirmation that Birch Rowe had brought, and the dates did not align, and the context did not align, and the discrepancy was plain. Judge Oakes reconvened the hearing 30 minutes after the scheduled time for the noon recess to end. He said that new information had come to his attention regarding the evidentiary basis of the claimant's filing. He said that he had reviewed the documents and the testimony now on record, and that he found the customary use argument unsupported by credible documentation. Hargreaves started to rise. The judge held up one hand without looking at him. Judge Oakes said the found property argument had more substance, but that he had reviewed the territorial statute carefully during the recess, and found that it applied to truly anonymous discovered property, meaning property with no traceable prior owner and no stated instrument of disposition. The ledger and the letter, taken together, provided both a traceable prior owner and a stated instrument of disposition, informal but coherent and consistent with the standard for testamentary intent that the territory's courts had applied in 2 prior cases he cited by name and date. He said the commingling problem was addressed by the documented record of Samuel Pratt's earnings in the ledger, which constituted a reasonable basis for estimating the personal portion of the cash, even if precise separation was not possible. He said the homestead claim was valid and would stand. He said the property found on the registered parcel, in light of the letter's testamentary intent and the ledger's supporting evidence, passed to the respondent as the person who met the criteria stated by the prior owner. He said Aldous Crane's claim was dismissed. He said it in the measured language of judicial pronouncement, without drama, each sentence placed with the same deliberate precision as Samuel Pratt had used in his letter, and effect was the same. Something that had been uncertain became certain, and the certainty had the weight of a thing that would not be lifted. The room was quiet for a moment after the gavel came down, the specific quiet of a space where something has been settled. She heard Martha Good release a breath behind her, a small sound, controlled, the breath of a woman who has been holding something for longer than a breath should be held. Aldous Crane rose from his chair and buttoned his coat, and walked out of the courtroom without looking at anyone, not at Hargreave, not at the bench, not at Nora. Birch Rowe was already gone, taken by Cal Decker to an anteroom off the clerk's office where a deputy was waiting. Hargreave gathered his papers with the professional efficiency of a man who has lost cases before and knows how to fold them up and carry them out. Clement Burr crossed to the respondent's table and shook her hand. His grip was solid and brief. He said she had given him good material to work with. He said this without qualification, as a professional assessment, which was the form of compliment she was most able to receive. Cal Decker came into the courtroom from the hall door and stopped beside her and said Birch Rowe would be charged with document fraud, and that Aldous Crane was the subject of an ongoing investigation that had now expanded in scope given what Rowe had disclosed. He said it without satisfaction, the way he said everything, as the delivery of information to someone who had a right to it. She said she was grateful for his work on the matter. He said he had not done it for her specifically. He had done it because the evidence had led where it led, and a marshal who follows evidence selectively is a marshal in name only, he said. James Calloway had understood this about the law, which was the same thing as saying he had understood it about people, and that the territory could use more people who understood it the same way. She thought about that for a moment. About James's particular quality of regard for the law, not reverence but respect. The respect you give a tool that works when you use it right and fails when you use it wrong. He had taught her this without using the word law, just by being the kind of man who said what he saw and did what he said, and held both to the same standard regardless of who was watching. She walked out of the Heartland County Courthouse into the November afternoon, sharp and cold, the carved eagle above the door blurred by weather into something that looked more like a suggestion of a bird than the thing itself. And she stood on the stone steps for a moment and looked at the street below and the sky above, and thought about what came next. What came next was the ride back north. What came next after that was the winter, and the work of the winter, and the bench under snow, and the animals to care for, and the wood stove in the morning, and Samuel Pratt's table in the evenings, with whatever she was reading or writing or thinking through. What came next after all of that was spring. And whatever spring brought, and she had enough experience now of what winter could lead to that she was not afraid of the arrival of spring. She had won. She was aware of this. She did not feel it in the way she had imagined winning might feel when she was standing on the ridge, with the empty tracks at her feet and the wind in her face, which she had imagined as a kind of relief, a pressure released, a door opening. What she felt instead was something quieter and more structural, like discovering that the floor she had been building was solid all the way through when you put your weight on it. Not the excitement of a new thing, but the confirmation of a thing that had been true all along and had simply required the right test to prove itself. She went to find her horse. The afternoon was fading at the edges into the long lavender of an early winter dusk, the kind of light that turned everything it touched into a version of itself that seemed more considered than the daylight version. She rode north out of the county seat with the cold coming down from the mountains ahead of her, and she thought about Birch Row in the clerk's office, speaking plainly to a recorder about what he had done, and about the specific quality of a person who finds the right action through entirely self-interested calculation. She had known men like that. James had known men like that. He had said once, with the flat philosophical acceptance that characterized his commentary on human nature, that a person who does the right thing for the wrong reason has still done the right thing, and that the world runs more on that than people like to acknowledge. She had thought this was cynical at the time, and understood now that it was not cynicism, but something closer to clear-eyed generosity, the willingness to accept good outcomes without demanding that they arrive in the correct costume. The road north was empty in the dusk. She rode at a steady pace, not pushing, letting the horse set its own rhythm on the familiar ground. The mountains ahead of her were losing their detail in the lowering light and becoming shapes, dark against a sky that was still holding the last of the day at its western edge. She thought about the hearing. She thought about Clement Burr reading from the ledger, Samuel Pratt's careful dated entries about seasons and earnings, 20 years of a solitary man's work turned into evidence in a courtroom he had never seen. She thought about what it meant to have your honesty outlive you by 40 years and still be doing work on your behalf. She thought about the kind of life that produced that kind of record, not a public life, not a successful life in any of the ways success is usually measured, but a life lived with enough internal consistency that the evidence of it was coherent, and coherence had its own power in a room where things were being decided. She thought about Aldous Crane walking out of the courtroom without looking at anyone. The controlled departure of a man who has planned for a specific outcome and received a different one and has not yet recalibrated. She did not hate him. She had spent some energy in the early months wondering whether she should hate him, and had concluded that the energy was better applied elsewhere. He had done what he had done out of a very ordinary human conviction, that he deserved more than he had been given and that the law was a tool for acquiring it, and this conviction was not unusual. What was unusual was that he had been wrong about both things, and the wrongness had been demonstrated in front of a room full of people, and that was a sufficient consequence without requiring her to add hatred to it. She rode north through the dusk and into the dark, and the stars came out above the mountains one by one, with the unhurried sequence of things that operate on their own schedule and require no acknowledgement, and she watched them appear and thought that this was the kind of night James had loved. cold and clear and so large that a person on a horse in the middle of it could feel exactly as small as they actually were, which was the correct scale at which to feel one's own importance. The road was good, and the horse was steady, and she knew every mile of it by now, and she rode without urgency through the November dark toward the bench, and the spring, and the cabin, and the fire she would build when she got there, and she did not look back. The winter came in hard the week after she returned from the county seat, which was the mountain's way of confirming that the hearing had concluded, and the season had been waiting for no other business before proceeding. 3 feet of snow fell in 4 days, and then the temperature dropped to the kind of cold that made the cabin walls tick and crack in the night, like a ship working against ice. And she stayed close to the wood stove and worked through her supply inventory, and read, and thought, and let the weather do what weather does without arguing with it. She had enough wood. She had always known she would have enough wood, because she had cut 4 cords in October when the calculation required it. And the calculation had been correct, and the correctness of it was not a source of pride, so much as a confirmation that the work she had done in the right season produced the results she had planned for. This was the version of satisfaction available to a person who does not leave things to chance, quieter than the other kind, and more reliable. The first week of the winter was the hardest in the specific way that first weeks are, not because of the cold itself, but because the cold was new and required adjustment. The animals needed more feed and more attention to their water, which froze in the trough by mid-morning if she did not break it regularly. The stovepipe needed checking after each heavy snowfall to make sure the cap had not been blocked by drift. The door swelled in the cold and required a shoulder to open, which she addressed with a draw knife and 30 minutes of patient work on the frame, and after that it opened cleanly. She was not lonely. She examined this at intervals during the long quiet evenings and found it consistently true, which surprised her enough that she examined it more carefully than she might have otherwise. She had expected loneliness to be the primary texture of a winter alone on the bench, the thing that required management and endurance. What she found instead was that the solitude had a quality she had not previously had access to, a kind of spaciousness in the mind that she had not known was missing until it was present. James's cabin at Ridgeback Valley had been solitary in a similar way, but she had been new there and the learning had occupied the foreground of every day. Here there was nothing new to learn in the immediate sense. She knew how to manage the cabin and the animals and the weather. What filled the foreground instead was thought, and thought turned out to be company of a specific and sufficient kind. She thought about Samuel Pratt's 19 years on the bench, and found she understood them better now than she had in September, when she had first read his ledger. Not the loneliness, which she still did not share, but the productivity of it. The way a mind deprived of external conversation turns inward, and becomes more articulate to itself. The way a place that asks nothing of you in the social register allows you to become more entirely yourself than any company permits. She thought Samuel Pratt had known this and had chosen it, not as a renunciation of human connection, but as a preference for a particular quality of existence, and that this was a legitimate preference, and that the world had been wrong to produce no accounting of it until now. She wrote this down in the blank pages at the back of the ledger, after his last entry. Not in imitation of him, but in continuation of him, the way a person writes in a space that has already been opened for writing. She wrote about the winter, and the animals, and the stovepipe, and the quality of the light through the west window in the afternoons, when the snow reflected it upward, and made the inside of the cabin brighter than the outside. She wrote about Clement Burr, reading from the ledger in the courthouse, and about the specific sound of Judge Oakes's gavel, and about Birch Row's flat voice describing what he had done. She wrote these things plainly and without drama, because plain writing was what the ledger had established as its standard, and she held to it. By February she had filled 40 pages. The investigation of Aldous Crane produced its findings in stages, each stage arriving in a letter from Cal Decker delivered by Darnell Hatch on his monthly supply run. The first letter, in December, reported that Birch Row had entered a full cooperation agreement with the territorial attorney and had provided documentation relating to 3 property transactions in the southern counties over the preceding 7 years, each involving a document irregularity similar to the one deployed against Nora's homestead claim. Disputed estates. Simplified. heirs, legal filings that looked like the natural operation of territorial law, and had been constructed to look that way by people who understood that most people never looked closely enough to see the construction. The second letter, in January, reported that Aldous Crane had retained new legal counsel and was contesting the fraud charges on the grounds that Birch Rowe had prepared the documents independently and without his direct instruction. This was the move she had anticipated. A man like Aldous Crane did not get to his position without understanding the value of distance between himself and the instruments of his plans. He had always worked through intermediaries: Harlan Voss, Birch Rowe, the Eastern lawyer. Each layer of separation was a layer of deniability, and he had cultivated them carefully. She wrote back to Cal Decker with a question she had been sitting with since the hearing. She asked whether the original instructions to Harlan Voss could be traced to Aldous Crane or only to the planning of the expedition itself. She asked this because Harlan Voss had used her name before she gave it to him, and someone had given it to him, and the most direct line between that information and Harlan Voss ran through Aldous Crane, who had known her name and her situation and her grandfather's land since the morning he had sent the postmarked letter. Cal Decker's response came in February with the supply run. He wrote that Harlan Voss had been offered a similar cooperation arrangement and had declined it on grounds that suggested he believed Aldous Crane would eventually prevail and that cooperation would cost him more than St. Helens. He wrote that this calculation was one he was working to correct. He wrote that the investigation was ongoing and that she should have patience. She had patience. She had been practicing it since before she could name it as a virtue. The snow began to pull back from the south-facing slopes in the last week of February, not melting so much as retreating, the way snow retreats in the mountains, reluctantly and by degrees, leaving behind a landscape that was the same as before, and entirely different from before in the way that things look when you see them clearly after a long period of obscurement. The bench emerged from its covering with the spring showing underneath it in the grass, green already at the roots, though the surface was still winter-pale, and the stream that fed the spring ran higher and faster from the melt and made a sound that filled the bench in the mornings, like a conversation resumed after a long pause. She began work on the bench itself in March. She had spent the winter thinking about what the land could carry and what it could not, which was the kind of planning that James had modeled as the correct relationship between a person and their ground, not what you wanted from it, but what it was capable of offering on its own terms. The bench would support a garden in the summer months, sheltered as it was on three sides from the worst of the alpine weather. It would support a small herd of cattle on the upper meadow grass through July and August, trailed up from the valley in late spring and back down before the first heavy snow. It would support the guiding work that had begun to present itself as a natural extension of what she already knew. Hunters who wanted elk and mule deer in the fall, and were willing to pay for someone who could find them in country that most hired hands had never seen from above. She had thought about the guiding work through the winter, with the specific interest of a person identifying a skill that belongs to them in the way that few things do, not because it was learned in a school or conferred by a credential, but because it had been built into her by years of the right kind of attention in the right kind of country. She could read the drainages. She could read the wind. She could read the way a herd of elk moved through a high park in the early morning and where it would be by midday, and whether the weather would push it lower or higher by evening. This was not knowledge she had acquired. It was knowledge she had become, slowly in the way that people become things through long exposure to what matters. She rode down to Ashford Falls in the first week of April for the first time since November, the bench finally passable enough for the animals to make the trail without difficulty. And the town received her with the particular attention of a place that has been watching a situation resolve and has its own sense of what the resolution means. Gus Pell came out of the livery when she rode in and took the horses without being asked, which was a form of welcome that spoke the language she was most comfortable with. Frank Aldridge had a credit running on her account that he explained had been contributed to by several parties over the winter months. People settling what they considered outstanding obligations to her grandfather's memory, or simply to the specific fact of what she had done and survived. And the total was large enough that she stood at his counter for a moment, recalibrating her understanding of what the word community meant in this context. She told Frank Aldridge she would apply the credit to supplies for the summer season and would settle any remainder in cash at fall prices. He said that was entirely acceptable and that the credit would hold. She walked the length of the main street and felt the town's attention moving with her, not the hostile attention of her first arrival, not even the cautious reassessment of her third or fourth visit, but something that had settled into a different register altogether. The attention of a place that has decided where a person belongs and is acknowledging that decision in the specific understated way of small western towns, which is to say by nodding and by removing hats and by holding doors without requiring the transaction to be named. Martha Good came down the hotel steps when Nora passed and fell into step beside her without preamble, and they walked together to the end of the block and back, and Martha Good said, in the practical tone of a woman delivering information that she considers useful and expects to be used, that she had been speaking with two men from the eastern cities who had written to ask about elk hunting in the high country north of the ridge, and that she had taken the liberty of telling them that there was a guide operating out of the bench who knew the country better than anyone currently working the drainages, and that they had written back expressing interest, and that she had their letters at the hotel desk if Nora wanted them. Nora said she wanted them. Martha Good said there was no fee for the introduction. She said it in the tone of a person closing an account, not the account of the biscuits and the cold beef, but a longer account, the one that had been sitting open since the morning. She had turned Nora away from the hotel door and sent her back out into the August Street. Nora took the letters. She wrote replies that evening at the table in her room at the hotel, 2 pages each, describing the terrain and the season and the terms she was setting. $4 a day and her keep, and the understanding that she led and they followed on the matter of where they were going and when. She named herself in the letters as N. Calloway, guide operating out of the bench at Ridgeback East, which was a name she had given the parcel in the privacy of her own thinking and which looked right on paper. She sent the letters the following morning with the eastbound post and rode back up to the bench with her spring supplies. The third letter from Cal Decker came in May. It was longer than the previous two and written with a care that suggested he had drafted it more than once. He wrote that Harlan Voss had recalculated his position after a conversation in the territorial jail that Cal Decker described only as clarifying, and had provided a sworn statement regarding the instructions he had received before the expedition. The instructions had come through an intermediary, a man named Pearson, who worked as a land assessor in the southern counties, and who had received them from Aldous Crane directly. Pearson had corroborated Voss's account in exchange for leniency on a separate matter that Cal Decker did not detail. The chain was complete. Aldous Crane to Pearson to Voss, to the expedition to the empty camp on the 4th day. The plan to leave her on the mountain without witnesses or resources or any means of return had originated with the man who had sent a letter dated before his brother was cold. The territorial attorney was proceeding with the full range of charges. Cal Decker wrote that he did not know what the outcome of the criminal proceedings would be, because outcomes were not his to determine, only to pursue, but that the evidence was clear and the documentation was solid and he was confident in the case. He ended the letter with a sentence she read several times. He wrote that James Calloway had once told him, years before, that the high country above the ridge was the most honest place he knew, because it kept no secrets and gave back exactly what you brought to it, no more and no less, and that he had thought about this sentence often in the months since the hearing, and found it useful as a general description of how he tried to do his work. She set the letter down on Samuel Pratt's table and sat with it. James had said that to Cal Decker years ago, which meant he had been in the business of knowing Cal Decker for years before she arrived on the bench, which meant the network of connection between her grandfather and this town and the people in it was older and deeper than she had understood. The account Roy Sutton had been holding for 4 years. The 12 years Martha Good had known James. The way Gus Pell had taken in her horses without being asked. She had understood these things individually as courtesy and as the residue of regard. She understood now that they were also structure, the structure of relationships built over years by a man who had been, in his quiet and undemonstrative way, the kind of person that a community holds in its connective tissue without advertising the fact. She had inherited this structure along with the parcel and the compass and the folding knife and the knowledge of every drainage within a day's ride of the ridge. She had not known it was part of the inheritance. She understood now that it was the most important part. The first hunters arrived in September of that year, the 2 men from the eastern cities, who had written through Martha Good's introduction. They came up the trail on horses rented from Gus Pell's livery, carrying more equipment than the elevation required, and she met them at the trailhead and led them up to the bench without hurry and without commentary on the equipment. They were pleasant men, younger than she had expected, in their 30s, and they were honest about what they knew and what they did not know, which was the quality she valued most in people she was going to spend time with in the high country, where the gap between those two categories had practical consequences. She put them in the lean-to shed she had expanded over the summer into a proper 2-room addition off the cabin's east wall, with 2 rope-strung beds and a small stove. She had built this addition herself over 6 weeks in June and July, with lumber packed up from the valley on the mule, working from a memory of James's framing technique that she had absorbed by watching him build a feed shed at Ridgeback Valley in her first spring on his land. The addition was not elegant, but it was tight, and it was warm, and it was hers in the specific way that things you build with your own hands over 6 weeks of physical effort are yours. She took the 2 men into the country north of the bench on the second morning, up through the timber and out into the high parks above treeline where the elk had been moving for 3 days. She knew, because she had been watching their signs since August and had a clear picture of their current range. She put the men in the right position by mid-morning, and the first of them had his shot before noon. It was a clean shot, well placed, and she dressed the animal on the ground in the high country, with the skill that comes from having done the same thing enough times that the knowledge lives in the hands rather than the mind, and she packed the meat out on the mule in 2 loads while the men helped as best they could, which was adequate. That evening she cooked from the tenderloin on the wood stove, and the 3 of them ate at Samuel Pratt's table, and the men talked about the mountains and about what they had seen during the day, and she listened and answered questions and offered information when it was useful and otherwise let the conversation go where it wanted to go. This was also something James had taught her without naming it, the understanding that people who have been in the high country for a day have a specific and genuine need to talk about what they have seen, and that the correct response to this is attention, not performance. The second man took his elk on the 3rd day. She packed it out the same way. On the 4th day she brought them to a ridge above the bench, where the view extended north and east across the full breadth of the range, peak after peak in the clear October light, and she let them sit there as long as they wanted without pushing them back down the mountain, because a person who has paid for 4 days in the high country deserves to sit on a ridge in October light for as long as they need to. They paid her at the trailhead, the rate she had set. They shook her hand with the specific quality of people who have received more than they contracted for and know it. They said they would write the following spring. She said she would expect to hear from them. She watched them ride south down the main road and went back up the trail to the bench. The fall season brought 3 more parties, all referred through Martha Good's network of Eastern correspondents, which turned out to be more extensive than Nora had understood. Martha Good knew people, specifically people with money, and the desire to spend some of it on the kind of experience that Western hunting represented to men of a certain type, and she had been in the business of connecting those people to local services for years, and she had simply added Nora's name to the list of services she recommended. This was not generosity, exactly. It was good business, and Martha Good was a woman who understood that good business and genuine support were not mutually exclusive, and often reinforced each other. By the end of October, Nora had earned more from guiding than she had spent on the bench's operation since September of the previous year. She sat with the numbers at the table one evening, and added them twice to make sure, and then sat with the confirmed total and thought about what it represented. Not wealth. Not security in any permanent sense, because permanent security was not a thing the high country offered, and she had stopped expecting it from the country, or from anything else. What it represented was margin, the specific freedom that comes from having more than you need for the immediate season, which allows the mind to plan forward rather than simply manage the present. She planned. She thought about a second lean-to addition off the cabin's north wall for storage and tack. She thought about a small root cellar dug into the bank behind the spring, which would keep vegetables through the winter and reduce her dependence on the valley supply runs. She thought about the cattle she could trail up to the upper meadow in summer, and the hay she could put up on the lower bench if she cleared another 2 acres of the tree line in spring. She thought about all of this in the practical, sequential way of a person who is building something that is meant to last, and the thinking felt like the right use of a winter evening in a warm cabin with good wood in the stove and the mountains dark outside the window. The final letter about Aldous Crane came in November of the second year, delivered by Darnell Hatch along with the winter supply run. Cal Decker wrote in his spare, accurate hand that the territorial court had found Aldous Crane guilty of fraud in the first degree and conspiracy to defraud, and that the sentence was 3 years in the territorial prison and a fine substantial enough that the disposition of several properties he owned in the southern counties would be required to satisfy it. He wrote that Birch Rowe had received a suspended sentence in exchange for his cooperation and had surrendered his license to operate as a land agent. He wrote that Harlan Voss had received 2 years and would serve them. He wrote, at the end of the letter, that he was retired from the marshal's position, effective the first of the new year, that a younger man was taking the office, and that he was going to spend the next months doing the nothing in particular that he had been putting off for 9 years. He said he hoped the bench was wintering well, and that the animals were sound. She wrote back the same day. She said the bench was tight and the animals were sound, and that the winter so far had been manageable. She said she hoped his nothing in particular was everything he needed it to be. She meant this in the precise way that people mean things they say plainly without ornamentation. She sent the letter down with Darnell Hatch on his next run and went back to her woodcutting. The fourth winter was the gentlest of the 4, which she understood to be coincidence rather than reward, but which she received gratefully nonetheless. The snowfall was consistent but not heavy. The cold settled in by December and held without the kind of murderous dips that had cracked the cabin walls in the first winter. The animals were healthy through February and March, and she lost none of them to the cold or to the small accidents that the mountains sometimes exacted in hard seasons. The spring runoff came clean, and the bench greened earlier than the previous years, the grass showing by mid-April in the south-facing meadow. She was sitting at Samuel Pratt's table on an evening in the 4th spring when she opened his letter for what she knew would be the last time she opened it the way she had been opening it, with the urgency of a person looking for something they need. She had read it many times in 4 years. She knew every sentence in it. She had memorized, without intending to, the rhythm of his careful hand and the particular way he built his meaning from small specific words arranged with the patience of a man who has learned that simplicity is not the absence of thought but its highest expression. She read it now differently, not as a document she needed anything from but as the company of a specific person, which was what it had always been and what she was only now ready to receive as such. Samuel Pratt had been 40 years old when he built the cabin she was sitting in. He had lived in it for 19 years and died in it in the winter of his 59th year, and had been careful and honest and solitary, and had loved a woman named Sarah, whose last name he had never written down, and had kept a dog named Ranger, and had carried guilt about a brass compass for 20 years, and had, at the end of it, done the most generous thing available to him, which was to leave what he had to someone who needed it, with the only instruction being that they use it to make a life. She had made a life. She was still in the process of making it, which was the correct state for a person of 25 to be in, but the foundation was solid and the walls were up and the roof held. The bench was hers in the patent and in the register, and in the daily fact of her own presence on it. The work was hers. The reputation was hers, built not by announcement but by the accumulated experience of every person who had ridden up the trail behind her and come back down with what they had come for. The cabin was hers and Samuel Pratt's at once, which was the arrangement they had reached without negotiating it. The dead and the living sharing a space the way that sometimes happens when the living are careful enough to make room for it. She folded the letter along its worn creases, set it back in the envelope, set the envelope inside the ledger and closed the ledger, and set it on the shelf where Samuel Pratt had kept it for 19 years before she found it. She took the bone-handled knife from its sheath and set it on the table. She took the brass compass from the inside pocket of the coat, James's coat that was fully her coat now, worn smooth at the elbows in the same places his elbows had worn it, and she set the compass beside the knife on the table and looked at the 2 objects in the lamplight. The knife had left James's hands and come to hers in the spring of her 19th year, pressed across the table at breakfast without ceremony. The gift of a man who did not make speeches about what he valued, but expressed it in the objects he chose to pass forward. She had worn it every day since, and would wear it every day going forward, not because it was the sharpest tool available to her now, or even the most practical, but because it had been in his hands before hers, and because objects that have been carried by people you love carry something of the carrying with them, some residue of the hours and the decisions and the ordinary days that had been lived in contact with them. The compass had traveled the longer road. James's hands to Samuel Pratt's hands, held in the keeping of a man who had tried for 20 years to return it, and had finally entrusted it to the only vault available to him, the ground, the years, the luck of whoever came next. It had come back to the family it had started with by a route that required 40 years, and the deaths of 2 men and the loss of a house and an 80-acre farm, and 2 days of walking in the mountains without food or shelter. She was not sure what to call the force that had produced this outcome. She did not need to call it anything. It was sufficient to sit with the object in the lamplight and understand that it had arrived where it was supposed to arrive, and that she was the right person to have it. She thought about what she was leaving. Not in the immediate sense, not in the sense of a woman of 25 who had no plans for departure, but in the longer sense that Samuel Pratt had written about in his November entry, the sense in which a person who thinks seriously about time eventually has to reckon with the fact that they are also, inevitably, the past of someone who has not yet arrived. The cabin would stand after her. The ledger would hold. The patent would keep. The knowledge of the drainages and the elk patterns, and the way the wind moved through the high parks in the early morning would be, if she was careful about how she held it, something that could be passed on in the same wordless practical way. James had passed things to her, through shared work and shared country, and the accumulated hours of paying attention together. She blew the lamp down carefully, turning the wick until the flame folded into itself and went dark. The cabin settled into the particular dark of a spring night on the bench, not absolute dark, the snow still holding on the upper elevations and reflecting enough starlight that the window was a pale rectangle in the darkness, and she sat with it for a moment before she stood. She went to the door and unbarred it, and stepped out onto the bench in the cold spring air. The mountains were there, exactly where they had always been, the same shapes against the same sky that Samuel Pratt had looked at for 19 winters. And James Calloway had looked at on whatever number of crossings had brought him through this country in the early 1860s. The spring ran steadily behind her in the dark, the same water it had been running through every season she had been here, and every season before her, and the star above the door was too dark to see, but she knew it was there, cut into the wood by a chisel in the spring of 1866, by a man who had wanted to mark the place as his in some permanent way. And it had outlasted him, and it would outlast her, which was the correct relationship between a mark and the person who makes it. She stood on the bench in the spring dark and listened to the water and looked at the mountains and breathed the cold air that came down off the peaks, carrying the smell of granite and pine and snowmelt, the specific compound smell of a world that existed before anyone named it and would exist after the naming was done. She had been left for nothing by people who thought nothing was what she was. She had walked into a ravine no one had mapped and found, under a hearthstone in a dead man's cabin, the floor she needed to build on. She had used it, not spent it, used it, the way you use good ground, planting what belongs there, and tending what grows and not asking the land to be anything other than what it is. The men who had tried to erase her were in a prison, or behind a suspended sentence, or somewhere south of here, reckoning with the distance between what they had planned and what had occurred. She did not think about them often. They were not the story. They were the obstruction that the story moved around. James was the story. Samuel was the story. The compass and the knife were the story. The 40 pages she had written in the back of the ledger were the story, and the patent in Ted Marsh's files, and the names of hunters who would write in April to book their September dates, and the lean-to addition off the east wall with its 2 rope-strung beds, and the root cellar she would dig in May, and the cattle she would trail up in June to the upper meadow that was already showing green at the edges in the April dark. She was 25 years old, and she had a patent and a trade and a table of her own, and a name that people in Ashford Falls and in the eastern cities where Martha Good's correspondence reached had begun to use in the context of the high country above the ridge, the way you use the name of a landmark, as a reliable piece of the terrain. She had been given a knife and a coat and $11. She had been given the knowledge to read a country that most people only moved through. She had been left on a mountain by men who thought that was the end of the accounting. It was not the end. It was the beginning of the part where the ground kept what it had been given and gave it back at the right moment to the right person. That was what ground did. That was what good people did, through the things they taught, and the things they wrote, and the things they set aside in tin-lined boxes under hearthstones for whoever came next. The world ran on this more than it ran on anything else she could name. The silent, accumulated investment of people who had cared enough about the future to do the right thing in the present, without any guarantee they would see the return. She went back inside, barred the door, lay down on the bed that had once been Samuel Pratt's, and before that no one's, and was now hers entirely, with the mountains outside and the spring running and the lamp cool on the table beside the knife and the compass, and she slept. She slept without the edge of alertness that had been present in her sleeping for 4 years, without the hand near the bone handle in the dark, without the listening ear oriented toward the sounds outside. She slept the way a person sleeps when they have stopped waiting for something to go wrong and have simply accepted the fact of where they are. Not safety, exactly. Not certainty. The mountains did not offer either, and she was not asking. She slept the way you sleep, when you are finally at rest in the right place at the right time with the right things around you, and the ground beneath the cabin was solid all the way down, and it was hers, and it kept.